Okay, so just kind of following along in the series, this is going to be another talk about misinformation. Um, but as Aoife mentioned, I am not an expert on misinformation. I'm a statistician. So I don't know about misinformation per se, but I see a lot of stuff that I interpret as misinformation from my perspective as a statistician and an epidemiologist. And I mean, really, what this mostly translates to for me is that I sit on Twitter, probably spend much time on Twitter, and particularly in the context of the last year or so, but even before, there's a very special kind of misinformation I think that really has a tendency to catch fire with people, and that is misinformation that seems to use the data and statistics, this magical tool for understanding the data. Um, and the thing you notice, again, as an amateur in the world of misinformation, is that people really do seem to react very strongly and are very quick to believe anything that they're told. If it comes along with a little plot like this one, and it shows some data and it's got a line going through there and maybe a couple of numbers, summarizing what that's supposed to say, people seem to really take that message forward very quickly without a lot of thought or consideration for what the actual truth underlying that information might be. And not surprisingly, I'll feature some examples of things gone wrong. This would be one of them, and I'm not going to get into it very much. The point is that the message being relayed by this particular plot is grossly, grossly wrong. There's nothing about the information underlying that plot that suggests what the people who shared it were trying to conclude from it. But again, it doesn't stop people. So what I really do is I spend a lot of my time scrolling Twitter and making these kinds of fakes also nonstop or almost nonstop. And so one of the things I wanted to try to share with people were just kind of my perspectives as a statistician and a clinical trialist on why I roll my eyes at so much stuff and what the common things that come up that kind of cause me to react like this. And so just a little bit more background on what it is that I do to kind of set the stage a bit is I primarily work in clinical trials. And science is very diverse. There's lots of different types of science. And in some respects, clinical trials are fairly straightforward. I mean, they're very complicated in practice, but what they seek to do is fairly straightforward compared to a lot of other scientific endeavors. And that is they ask a question of, does this thing work? In the context of clinical research, what we really want to know is if we can get clinicians to change what they're doing today because we have a new idea, a new treatment, a new surgery, a new procedure that works better than the old thing. So we do a lot of these studies just to figure out, do things work? And from my perspective as a trial statistician, but also as an epidemiologist, I really think about these things in kind of two bits. And the first bit of my job is to understand causal inference. And so when we are looking at studies trying to understand if treatments work, for example, we are usually interested in cause, this notion of one thing causing another, because we want to make a change, right? We see something wrong, we want to change that outcome. So we do something differently in order to bring about that change, like use a different treatment. So that's the kind of first bit. And importantly, I think for most of us, regardless of our background or what we're doing, causal questions tend to be the most compelling ones. And they're certainly the ones that we're flooded with as we engage in media or social media or anything else. We're constantly being flooded with messages of this works, this fixes that problem, this causes that problem. These are the decisions we should make to change these outcomes. So these are the kind of problems we're dealing with constantly. And so I think about causality quite a lot and the tools that I use to kind of think about causal questions. The other aspect of my job as a statistician working in clinical trials comes down to this issue of statistical inference. And statistics on one level gets a little bit of a bad rap. If you're a statistician and you tell people I teach statistics, like half the time the people you're talking to just look at you and they go, oh my God, I hated statistics. Don't do that to people, by the way. It's really unsettling and rude. No, I'm just kidding. You can probably do it because you probably earned that ability to gripe, because the chances are when you took statistics, it was probably presented to you as a very dry and heavily mathematical subject. But the real beauty of statistics, if you can get past that initial introduction that we usually get so wrong, features of statistics, it's really much more philosophical. Statistics is really much more about learning about the world. It's much more about these kind of deeper questions. Is there such thing as truth? And if there is truth, can we understand what it is? And we do certainly use a lot of math and statistics, but it's not the main point. I think it turns people off. But those are the kind of perspectives I try to bring when I think about this kind of idea around misinformation, people constantly misinterpreting data. And so the talk really is something that touches on some of these key ideas before, things that pop into my head to help me understand data. And more importantly, statistics is kind of interesting in that it's really good at helping you sniff out the nonsense. It's never going to tell you what the truth is, but thinking like a statistician is often going to help you rule out the stuff that's obviously wrong. But this talk, and I've given kind of talks like this before, it's changed over the years, unfortunately, because now it's not just about the things that these kind of tools or ways of thinking about things. I also have to emphasize this point, and I didn't used to have to do this, that it's really on you to protect yourself from misinformation. And what I mean by that is I think that, and maybe this is a bit naive, but I kind of feel like once upon a time, the people who were spreading misinformation were kind of somewhat easier to sniff out because you could kind of detect their motives, right? So you might be able to figure out that someone has got a reason to try to, to confuse you or whatever, to distract you, to give you misinformation, to manipulate you, because they had, some kind of a bad intention. And one of the problems, though, that I think is becoming, quite serious is that we now have a lot of really well-intended people who just don't know any better in some respects and will quite unintentionally misinform you and fool themselves in the process. And a lot of those people are working as scientists and academics. So before I talk about some of the other stuff, I just want to kind of linger here for just a minute and emphasize a few things about kind of academia and why we should be very cautious. We shouldn't just accept that what experts are telling us when it comes to the data and the statistics is exactly correct. We should always be very skeptical of this. And one of the perspectives I think that's been the most for me is this idea of research waste. And so there's a very famous paper in the Lancet in 2009 that kind of got into this idea that there are multiple stages in the research process where we wind up wasting a lot of the resources we invest in research, whether that's in academia or industry. And these are things like we ask questions that probably aren't all that important. We kind of chase the interests of the investigator a lot more than we chase the interests of the people who pay the bills and the public. People use inappropriate methods, poor study designs. They do a bad job of analyzing data, and I'll talk about that very briefly. And then for my librarian colleagues, they would be very familiar with the fact that a lot of the stuff that gets produced never gets shared, and when it is shared, it's shared in venues that aren't accessible to a wide variety of people. So there are problems that exist in academia and in science that are now contributing to this overall problem of misinformation, but they're also kind of veiled in or shrouded in like this sense of authority and good intentions. You're expecting scientists are trying to do a good job. So where do these problems come from? And some of these issues have gotten so serious at this point, though. So these are for people who are familiar with the medical research. These are quotes from editors from two of the most prominent scientific journals in clinical research, the New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet. And both of these quotes, from the past 15, 20 years, getting a little bit dated there, but both of them casting a lot of doubt on the quality of the research that's being published in their own journals, right? So I think you really have to take this in for a minute to understand that these are people who are the head of these journals. They're making ultimately the decisions about what goes into them. But even they're concluding at some point that a lot of the stuff that gets published as science is not of a very high quality, even in the venues we perceive to be the highest quality. And the one quote I always have to share when I get into this kind of a topic is that from Doug Altman. He was a statistician. He was kind of the lead statistician and reviewer for the British Medical Journal. And he's done an inordinate amount of work before his passing on improving the quality of science. And he made this very simple point in 1994. We need less research, better research, and research done by reasons. And the point here is that a lot of these problems, that we were touching on with research waste and failure to reproduce results and whatnot in major journals, they really come down to, like a lot of things, to just poor incentives for researchers. And we live in a world where researchers are asked to produce more and more research, and they get rewarded for that, and with very few checks on the quality of that research. And this can kind of come through in a lot of different ways. And so these incentives can be made clear with a little bit of effort. So this is just an example from the world of clinical trials of how well-intentioned researchers can often inadvertently kind of skew what science looks like by the decisions they make. And so just to give this little plot here some context, when we work in clinical trials, we are usually trying to understand if a new treatment works. And when we say works, what we mean is that's in the context of it having some effect on some outcome of interest, right? So if I'm going to give someone a drug intended to improve their blood pressure, then that outcome of interest would be their blood pressure, right? And I would hope that in a group that got some new drug, they'd have a lower blood pressure than a group that didn't get that new drug. And that would help me to start to believe anyway this new treatment made sense. And so we have this very important issue of outcome selection in clinical trials. And it used to be that when scientists would report the results of their research, what they would do is they would often cherry pick, they'd use lots of different outcomes. So let's see if the drug has an effect on this and this and this and that and this and that and this and that and this and that. And then they would go through and do their statistical analyses of the resulting study data. And then sometimes by chance alone, they would see in the data in front of them some evidence that this drug has a beneficial effect. And what they would do is they would pick out those instances and they would put those in the papers, and they would share those results. And then for those outcomes where they didn't seem to have an effect of the drug, they would hide that away. Right. So what this plot shows you then is this idea that before the year 2000, you could look at the results from a bunch of different studies. So each of these dots is a different study, okay? And dots below this value of 1 here indicate that that treatment was beneficial for that particular outcome. Excuse me. So the overall pattern you see here for this particular group of studies is that the results were almost always beneficial, right? There was almost always some evidence of some benefit of the treatment up to 2000. Now, that's pretty amazing. You look at this and you go, wow, biomedical research is incredible. Like, look at all these amazing treatments we're figuring out and helping the lives of people. And the problem is that what happened is in 2000, we brought in a clinical trial legislature that meant people had to start registering these outcomes before they started the study. They had to start saying, this is my primary outcome, this is my secondary, and whatnot. And they weren't allowed to change those in principle. And so once that started happening, so these people were in all of these studies, when you add the data from after that change in policy, what happens, right? All of a sudden, the results are no longer saying that all this magic, all this stuff works, we're doing a great job. It now shows us that most things don't work, right? Which actually fits a lot more with my own kind of perception of studies, given all the ones I've seen. So there are incentives there that are baked in. I'm not saying these people over here were cheating or trying to deceive people. There could be some of that happening, but I'm convinced a lot of these people themselves don't understand how statistics work and how experiments work. And so they were fooling themselves in really simple ways. But the point here is that these incentives exist clearly for us to fool ourselves. And one of the issues with science when it comes to this kind of preventing, let's call this misinformation, and when it comes time to prevent it, we often rely on, or think we rely on, these journals again to help us with that. So this was an interesting study on the same topic called Compare. And so what here is that these researchers went out and they checked 67 different trials, and they looked at the reports of research from those trials. And they double checked that the outcomes that were reported in the report of the research, so in the published paper of the research, matched up with what was in the clinical trial record. And so what it shows here that out of the 67 trials they checked, only 9 were perfect, meaning that the report of the research was exactly about the outcomes they said they were going to do when they did the trial registry. Importantly, among those remaining trials that weren't perfect, there were 354 outcomes that were listed in the trial registry that didn't report on, and 537 new outcomes that were added. So even though now we have this clinical trial registry, there's clearly still a lot of scope for people to still selectively choose to report different outcomes and to skew what the information is out there in the world. But this study, what was very interesting about it, it took it one step further. For the 58 studies that weren't perfect, they sent letters to each of those journals, to the editor, clearly demonstrating what had happened, that there was a skewing of the results. And of those 58 letters sent, only 18 of them were actually published in the journals. And so the point here is that the scientists have incentives to not present the results in the most accurate way. The journals very much have incentives as well to protect essentially the reputation of the research once they've published it. And so you can see there at the bottom right, 32 of these letters were rejected by the editor. So this is a straightforward demonstration, this project, that you're sending a letter saying you've published something that we know is incorrect. Here's the reason it's incorrect. Here's why it matters. And 3258, the editors didn't care. That information is hidden now from the public. The public doesn't understand that the results need to be interpreted in light of this. The other issue that comes up, and then I'll move on to the stat stuff, and I'll get off my groaning, moaning here. This is for the librarians, and I'm fortunate to work with librarians fairly frequently. I've become much more over the years. I've become much more sympathetic and appreciative of the jobs they do, and mainly because part of my job now is as a statistician working on clinical trials, is I work with other scientists. My job is to collaborate with people and to contribute the bits I do to the projects that they run. And I think about data like this, that we have a design and then it produces some raw data, and then we usually do some kind of modification or double checking of the data. And then we run statistical models and produce results and make decisions based on all of that. So there's this kind of pipeline. And the problem here, the risk here, is that at any point along this data pipeline, if something goes wrong, then the summaries and the inference are likely to be wrong too. And so this is the stuff we think of, the stuff on the right is the statistics, so to speak, and we pay a lot of attention to it, but not a lot of attention, particularly in academic research. And I'm always talking about biomedical research and public health research that I'm very familiar with. I'm not commenting on other areas. I don't work in those areas. But I have it on good authority. These problems are common across the sciences. Any problem in here can invalidate the results if we don't pay much attention to what happens in here. And so you can get very, extreme problems that happen. So for example, here's a clinical trial published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And the original result here is on the left. And essentially what lines mean is that the intervention, meaning the new treatment they were testing in this clinical trial, those people lived longer on average. So this was a beneficial intervention for them. The problem was, and this result got published and everything else, the problem was that in the analysis, they flipped one of the variables, the variable used to indicate which group patients were in, usual care versus the intervention groups in this experiment, this clinical trial. They flipped the two things just by accident, which completely, of course, reversed the results. And so when the actual results were redone, it's just a matter of flipping the labels, really. And what you, of course, find then is that actually the intervention was much worse for people. And so this is an example of, a really stark example of real life consequences that could come out of these kind of mistakes, simple mistakes with data. So no longer about poor incentives and, misjudging statistics, but actually just kind of poor technical skill around data, which is a real serious issue. And importantly, this was stuff that happened out of Johns Hopkins by an experienced biostatistics group. So these people would be at the top of the food chain, and this kind of a mistake extremely, extremely rare for them. And to their credit, they owned it and they fixed it and they resolved it. But if these people can make that kind of a mistake, then pretty much anybody can. You'd imagine that a lot of research that happens, particularly in an academic setting, doesn't pay nearly as much care for these data processes as these people do. And over time, I used to be really interested, well, I still am really interested in statistics in terms of like kind of philosophy and inference and decision-making and everything else. But it's just become more and more clear to me that it's these issues around basic data management and manipulation that are probably the bigger problem. And those are the areas, again, where scientists don't generally do a very good job of addressing these problems. And so fortunately, we have people like Aoife, who gave the introduction, who works with me at Corker. I work with her, who gives people lots of great advice on how to improve their data management practices to avoid some of these problems. But again, it's just an underlying source of misinformation. And it became really clear to me when people started just sending me their data. So when I first took this post as a clinical trial statistician, 5, 6, 7 years ago now, people would start to send me their data sets like, hey, can you have a look at this? And I was just blown away by the variety and the creativity people had with coming up with never-ending novel ways of putting information into spreadsheets that would befuddle anybody upon opening them. And it's really been very eye-opening. And again, just to come back to this point about how much research is out there, there's no oversight of this either, right? So there's so many journals now asking for so many reviewers, and nobody's asking to check on the data governance. Nobody's asking to check on data management procedures and so on and so forth. So the big point here is that probably now one of the most important, I think, sources of misinformation, comes from scientists themselves. And just to kind of bring it all home on one other level, and then I will promise to finish my little rant here. The universities themselves are quite incentivized, to not stop poor research from being shared widely. And one of the issues with this is that, a lot of societies don't really fund education like they used to. And there's an argument there for whether they should or shouldn't. And that's not an argument I'm trying to engage in. The point, though, is that when a university has more and more students and more staff, but less and less money coming in, those universities are required to try to get funding from other ways. And one of the ways we do this is through trying to get grants from research funders and charities. And to do that, we have to make ourselves as attractive as possible. And so it's become actually very common, not just for scientists to not understand statistics and data probably as well as they should, or not just to use poor data management practices. But now you see more and more scientists engaging in kind of a lot of hype. And I see this constantly. Scientists who we trust to produce, important information will, do a research study. They'll interpret it in the most favorable light possible. The university will do a press release, further kind of hyping it. Then it gets into the Guardian, where some journalist types it even more. And, it just creates this big, huge problem. And usually it winds up with, in a book, someone writes a book. And that's actually one of my biggest signs for a scientist, who might not always be on the up and up, unless they're writing a book like this from Stuart Ritchie, which is a book all about the things I'm talking about. And so this is a kind of topic that you might even be interested in. I'd really highly recommend this. This kind of gets into it in the nitty gritty with lots of examples and everything else. Okay, so let's talk about these kind of little trickier bits, focus in more on the actual business of causal inference and statistics. And the first thing that happens in the wild where people fool themselves is this concept called regression to the mean. And this will be something that a lot of people have heard about before. It's kind of out there, floating around, and people do hear about it from time to time. But I'll start with a story. And this is a story that a psychologist named Daniel Kahneman shared in a very famous book of his, actually. And the story was essentially there are these fighter pilots and their trainers. And they were trying to maximize the performance of the fighter jet pilots. And so they hired a psychologist to come and help them and figure out how they could get them to perform better. And the psychologist came and they said, well, you should give positive reinforcement to your fighter pilots. When they do well, you should tell them they did a good job. And the fighter pilot trainers, they they shook their head and they furrowed their brow and they said, that's, there's no way, that's madness. That's not how it works at all. And the psychologist, well, what do you mean? And the trainers were clear. They were like, well, they go out and what happens is they do a great job. They have a great day in training and we pat them on the back and we say, good job. And the next day they do worse. And then when they go out and they have a terrible day, we put the boot to them and we get on them and we chastise them. And the next day they go out and do better, right? But what's happening here is this idea of regression to the mean. They are selecting people when they're doing their best and doing something in response to that. And then they see that the people don't do as well the next time, and they attribute that to the thing they did. In other words, they're taking credit for this change in the behavior or the outcome, essentially. Just to bring this to a bit more of a statistical point of view, I could think about this in terms of maybe a clinical study. And let's say we have a clinical study with a group of people. Each person is represented by a dot on the plot here. And let's say we're going to have two measures of blood pressure. And so the x-axis here is we have a measure of blood pressure at the beginning of the study. And then we have another one at the end of the study called follow-up. And what we can see basically from this scatter plot of points is that there is a strong positive relationship between the two measures, right? So you tend to have if you have a lower value at baseline, you tend to have a lower value at the end of follow-up. If you have a higher value at baseline, you tend to have a higher value at the end of follow-up. And so that's fine. What often happens though in research studies and other contexts is that we make a selection of people based on this baseline outcome as they enter into a study. And so, for example, if I was doing the clinical trial of a medicine aimed at trying to reduce blood pressure again, I might choose to do that study in people with higher values of blood pressure, right? We do the study in the people who need the help the most. And that's probably makes a lot of sense in every instance. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select the people that start with relatively higher values of blood pressure. Just like in the story with the fighter pilot, I'm starting with the people who did really well or did very poorly, and I'm reacting to the fact that they've done well or done poorly. So here I'm reacting to the fact that some of these people had higher blood pressures at baseline. And so what often happens then is that people make comparisons about the distribution of those measures at baseline in blood pressure compared to those for the same people at follow-up. And so if we take and select these people, and let's back up one step here. If we look at this line here of the trend line, what you see is essentially a mirror image, not a perfect mirror image, right? But you see that there's a balance of observations on both sides of the diagonal. As soon as I make that cut and I only choose the people with high blood pressure, you see that a disproportionate number of them follow below that line. In other words, these are people who wound up with a diastolic blood pressure at follow-up that was lower than when they started at baseline, even though the overall trend is that the same roughly proportion of people falling below that line, people who later values were lower, is the same as the people higher above the line. As soon as I make that selection, I've now distorted that. And so then if we were to actually look at that distribution, so if I would just made these little bar plots where I just added a person and tallied them all up and put the sum here for all the people with the blood pressure of 93 at baseline and 94, 95, and I got this little histogram showing me how those values were distributed. If I did that for those people at the baseline at the start, and then I did the same thing for their values at the end of the study, and then compared the means, I would see that their mean values as a group had gotten lower. And what often happens in situations like this is people then conclude, if they gave some kind of intervention in between those two time points. In other words, if they took the people with high blood pressure, they gave them a pill, and then they measured them again at follow-up, and they saw that the mean blood pressure in that group at follow-up was lower. Again, like the fighter jet pilots, they would attribute it to the intervention that they gave. Even though I know from the simulation, I haven't given them anything, right? I've completely controlled this as a simulation. So this is one really, really popular way that you can kind of almost make effects of treatments and other things, magic bracelets or whatever appear. And so you have to protect yourself against this. And the best way to do it is you look out for two things. Essentially, you look out for this selection, right? This is all about choosing people with high values or low values, more extreme values than average at some point, and then looking within those same people or animals or whatever it is at a later time point, and then being surprised when the distribution of things has seemingly improved or become less extreme. So always, anytime you see within person comparisons and stuff like this, it's that's the red flag. Studies of pain are very common, something that this happens in. Okay, so that's regression to the mean. The other little couple bits I'm going to talk about bring us also on the topic of kind of causal inference. And it's very easy to see associations or relationships in data and to make conclusions about causal relationships. And that's really a big jump, right? When we see a relationship between two things changing in nature and they change together, and we conclude that one thing is causing the other, that can lead us to then change the world around us to try to improve it. But if those two things were related for other reasons, other than a cause and effect relationship, and I'll talk about these different types of reasons and as we go on here, then that's exactly where we can start making poor decisions. So, I mean, one of the most obvious kind of examples of getting this wrong is essentially kind of reversing causality, right? So here you have this old comic book, Family Circus, I think it was called. I don't know if they had it in Ireland. This is from when I was a kid, back when we had newspapers. And I'm just kidding, librarians. I know we still have newspapers. So I said, I wish they didn't turn on that seatbelt sign so much. Every time they do, it gets bumpy, right? The causality is reversed here. Everybody gets this. Everybody understands why this is, I don't know if it's funny or not, but everybody gets the point. But things can quickly become much more complicated than that. Another thing we look out for constantly in terms of making causal inferences about things is the concept of what we call simple confounding. And confounding is just mixing up essentially causal effects. And so here we have an example where we have two things, let's say X and Y, and I'm asking questions about, does X cause Y, right? And so let's say that, let's say X is my hair color. I'm getting steadily more and more gray. And then let's say that Y is my waist circumference, which is also steadily growing, particularly in the past year. And I've probably gotten quite a bit more gray at the same time. And so I might see that these two things are kind of going together in time, or I might recruit a bunch of people and measure their hair color and see how gray it is. And I might measure their waist circumferences and make another one of those scatter plots and see that they're related. The two things kind of tend to go up together. But obviously what I'm missing out in a situation like this is that there's a third variable here called C, labeled C. And it's that thing that is a cause of the other two things. So it's age in this example. I'm getting older, so my hair is getting grayer and my waistline is growing. And so if I was to see this relationship between hair color and waist circumference, and I was to go get everybody a bottle of hair dye, obviously it's not going to solve the waist circumference problem, is it? It's confounded by something else. And so this is stuff that you see constantly. One of the famous or best or worst or whatever you want to say it examples over the course of the past year in terms of the COVID pandemic was this wonderful, this is from real scientists who put out what we call a preprint, a paper reporting some research before it goes to a journal for supposed peer review and then publication. And they were relating here on the y-axis here, deaths per million population. So essentially the mortality rate associated with COVID-19. And then they were looking at the head of cabbage consumption per day in these different countries. And so they find this, this nice little line fits through there. And again, like I'm laughing, but a lot of people didn't laugh at this. They saw this. Oh, there's Ireland doing great. And, they saw this and they said, the cabbage. And if you leave this talk and you go Google or search for cabbage COVID-19, you will find no shortage of news articles hyping up the idea that eating cabbage is going to be good for preventing mortality from COVID-19. Interestingly, there's not been a follow, this was in June of last year, there's not been a follow-up to this paper. If the authors were so committed to this as an important hypothesis and actually want to do something about fixing the pandemic, you think they'd keep an eye on this and see if the data becomes stronger or weaker. But that didn't happen, probably for very obvious reasons. And the problem with stuff like this is called ecological fallacy. It's another type of way of confounding to happen, is that there's lots of different things about these countries that are different, not just the deaths per million population and not just how much cabbage people are consuming. There's lots of other stuff about those places that are very, very different. So it's not hard to find relationships like this. I'm actually going to skip forward because I want to have plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to skip forward to what I think is probably the trickier thing in the talk, but sometimes the more interesting one. And this is the one you'll see examples of this maybe after this talk, and you can amaze your friends with the understanding of this concept of what we call collider bias. And it's very closely related to this idea of confounding. And what happens in collider bias, I always explain with this example. I really like basketball. I still play basketball. I haven't played for a year. But I still play basketball, a few times a week, and I watch a lot of it right now because the NBA playoffs are on in the States. So I'm sitting up late at night watching games, and we could think of a world that's described by this set of relationships among three variables. Okay, so I'm going to say that there's two factors that you can be characterized by that make it more likely for you to become a professional basketball player. You can either be very tall, or you could just play, right? You just know how to play. You've got game. And both of those things, I'm saying with this little graph that I've shared here, I'm saying both of those things are causes of your ability to play basketball. Now, importantly, what's missing here is a little line going from being tall to having game. And what I'm saying there is that you can have game and not be tall. You can be tall and have game. These two things aren't generally related in the population at large, is the point. All right, so this is the kind of setup for this. However, when we only look at professional basketball players, what we find is actually there's a very strong relationship between being tall and having game, so that people who are tall and professional basketball players tend to not have game, and people who have got game and are professional basketball players tend to not be tall. All right, so what am I talking about? What is going on here? So we can think about it again, just looking at a scatter plot, and imagine each of these dots here is a person. And down here, we've got some version of their height, some metric of their height, and over here, we've got some metric of their playing ability. And the scatter plot here should tell us that there's no real trend or relationship between these two variables. In other words, if you're tall, there's a pretty good spread of ability. If you're short, there's the same spread of ability and everything else. However, if I start picking out the people who are likely to be basketball players, it's the people who have a high value for got game or have a high value for height. So it's the people out in this region, right? These are the professional basketball players. And so in this simulation, they're highlighted by the red dot. And so the thing that should now jump out to you is that if I was to look at the relationship between these two variables, in other words, this is what we're doing all the time. We see associations between things. They tend to go together, and we make inferences about them regarding causal relationships. You might conclude that there's some kind of a strong relationship between those two things based on this observation of the data. When you're only talking about the basketball players, that's fine. But the problem happens when you start to then make inferences about the population at large based on what you've seen in the basketball players. Now, maybe not everybody here finds the basketball example very compelling. So this is another really good example of this from Molly Wood. She's an epidemiologist. And it's basically an explanation of why the hot people you've dated are awful people. And why the great people you've dated aren't as hot. And so basically you have the same idea here, right? So in the upper left, you've got hot but not nice, and hot and nice, ugly and mean, nice and not hot. And so there's a group of people here you probably aren't going to date, ugly and mean. And so you pull those people out of the graph here, and you move over to this one. And if you were to then fit a line again through the remaining data points, what you see is an inverse relationship. So if you go around thinking that hot people are usually not very nice and nice people are usually not very hot, and that's based on the people you date, it's just because you're getting this skewed view of what's out there. Sometimes these things can get quite serious in very tricky ways. And this will be the last example, and then I'll very happily take any questions that people have. This is essentially a study that was looking at the impact of maternal smoking on the birth weight of offspring and the probability of a baby dying, being stillborn, or dying in infancy, sorry. And so essentially what you see here is this description of the data is we have two lines reflecting two different groups, right? So there are the babies who are born to non-smoking mothers with this dashed line, and the babies born to mothers who smoked. And along the x-axis here, then we have the birth weight of the baby. So you have the larger babies here on the right, and then smaller babies, very small babies on the left. And then on the y-axis here, we have this mortality. So the higher you are here, then the more mortality happening in that group of infants. And so perhaps not surprisingly, when we look at, kind of the global average birth weight is somewhere around, 3,200, 3,500 grams. So this is kind of the kind of usual birth weight, so to speak. It's probably not surprising that the babies born to women who smoked is higher. In other words, having more mortality than those who didn't smoke. However, when you look here, just among the low birth weight babies, it actually flips. These lines cross. And while they kind of look like they're not very far apart, they actually are meaningfully apart because this is from a huge study. And so just looking at this little thing here, it started to lead people to believe that, yes, we can see that smoking is definitely bad for infant health, maternal smoking, but that it might somehow be protective for babies who were born very small, right? And a lot of people started investigating this and writing papers about it and everything else. It was a very compelling idea. The problem here is the same idea of what we called collider bias. And that name comes from this idea of those two arrows coming together. Like, so before, when we were looking at the basketball players, we had the height, whether they had game. Now what we're looking at is some kind of a collider bias now between smoking and some other factors that we haven't measured. So in other words, when I take the babies that are born low birth weight, in other words, when I just focus on this end of the graph, I'm selecting the low birth weight babies, and I'm asking about smoking and how that influences mortality. There can be other things that we haven't measured and accounted for that can also lead the baby to have low birth weight and have higher mortality. So for example, some kind of genetic problem, so to speak. And so as soon as I've selected on low birth weight, just like when I've selected on basketball players, those who are tall tend to not have game and those who have game tend to not be tall. If I'm a low birth weight baby and I'm low birth weight, but my mom doesn't smoke, then there's an increased chance there's other things that explain the reason I'm a low birth weight baby, and those things are related to my mortality risk. So this is the kind of tricky thing that can happen, and so we call this collider bias. So another really great way to learn about collider bias is to hop on Twitter and type in collider biases, because people who understand it love pointing out collider biases. There's nothing more than a smug statistician who's identified a collider bias. And the other clue about them is that they often get called paradoxes. So people say, there's an obesity paradox. If you have obesity, it protects you from heart disease. It's almost always something exactly like this. Okay, I've gone a little over, I think. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you. This is the part where you tell me my mic was off the whole time.
Yeah, we didn't hear a word. No, that was brilliant. Thanks a million, Darren. Once again, fascinating and terrifying. Yeah, you've also, I think, communicated in a way that we can all understand. Yeah, so there are some questions that I'll go straight to. Peter asks, are there a set of easy steps that ordinary people can use to evaluate and understand data and statistics properly? Is there a dummy's guide to understanding data?
It's fair enough. It's a good question, and it isn't something that's important, I think, for people to get a grip on. There was a book published in the last year. There's a British statistician, one of the first people that comes to mind, and I can put his name in the notes or in the chat in a minute when we're done talking. But his name is David Spiegelhalter, and he heads up an institute in the UK about risk communication. And so he spent his kind of career thinking about how to communicate health risks and other types of risks to people through statistics. And he wrote a very nice book in the past couple of years. I think that it's a really nice introduction to exactly like the main, I think, points of statistics. I think the flip side of that question, though, again, I really like it, is that unfortunately there aren't that many shortcuts. Now, there are a lot of, again, kind of online courses people can take. And I guess this leads to another issue, which I mentioned on how some statistics training can be quite poor. And it kind of leaves you stuck on, how do I know I've chosen a good course or a bad course or whatever. There is stuff out there, but it does take work. And I don't think there's, quick and easy ways to do it. Now, one thing we were doing a couple of years ago, and I'm hoping to start back up, is to get another statistics for citizen scientists group going in the Cork area. And so oftentimes you can find other kind of people who are interested in this kind of thing too, and get together with them and learn from each other is another kind of thought. But no easy answers, I'm afraid. I wish there were.
Yeah, I'm just thinking there, if you might say that name again, Darren. I'm seeing.
Yeah, David Spiegelhalter, but I can, I said I'll add it to the chat.
Well, as this, there are dozens of librarians that we're talking to now. I'm presuming they're all tapping away, and someone will.
There you go.
Someone's going to put that book into the chat any minute now. I can sense it coming. So that's brilliant. Thanks, Darren. Yeah. I mean, you did say earlier that we do need to take responsibility as well for checking out the fact whether we're being misinformed or not. Certainly as professionals. Well,
step one is always to reserve judgment, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's probably one of the most helpful things is just to, okay, someone had said something, it's very convincing, they've got some data there, they have a statistical model, they've rattled off some arcane figures to me, and they seem very reasonable, they seem like very reasonable people. Over and over again, you'll see, especially for people who enjoy a little bit of social media with their science, is if you just wait a day or two, inevitably someone else is going to pick up on the problems if they're there and say something about it.
Yeah, and as you said, go to the sample, go to the data. I suppose I will have questions for that on you, on that later. As well, and Aoife might have won on that actually. She says one of her first lessons in stats was that correlation does not equal causation, and has found herself repeating quite a lot lately. But how do we communicate this more widely as librarians, in your opinion? As librarians involved in digital literacy, that figures and graphs often have no real truth or value.
No, I think that's fair enough. So I think one of the important things that's come out of the field, in particular of epidemiology, is embracing causality. And so if we start with that quote, a very famous quote, correlation is not causality. Well, correlation is usually a pretty good clue about causality. It's just not a sufficient clue about causality, right? When things are causally related, they often tend to be correlated. It's just that we have to do more work. And some of the arguments from the field of epidemiology have been that kind of truism, correlation is not causality, has led us to be overly cautious about our interest in causality. And what I mean by that is people do studies and they bend over backwards, left, right, and center, to avoid using what a very well-known epidemiologist named Miguel Hernan says, he calls the C word, cause. So we saw an association where it's just a relationship, that we're definitely not saying it's a cause. And then they do all the hand waving and then you see the press release, and then you see the newspaper article, and the same author is, talking to the journalist saying, oh yeah, it definitely causes that, right? There's a disconnect because we're scared of causality. And so one of the most important things there is to engage with this literature on causal inference, right? To how do people make decisions about cause? And so when I do a lot of the teaching I do in clinical trials and appraisal of scientific literature, we come back to methods for causal inference and think about it very clearly. So I think what I think is a really nice exercise is for people to think about what happens when you flip on a light switch and the light comes on. Do you know that there's a causal relationship between those two things? I think most people would say yes, right? You'd say, I know that this causes that. And so then it's important to think about, why are you so certain that this correlation between the two things is a cause? And it's because you understand, you know that there's wires there. Someone's told you about electricity. You understand the mechanism because that's the thing that's been built and engineered. And so your ability to understand it as a cause is supplemented. So it's correlation. I flip the light switch, the light comes on, but it's not like the rooster crowing and the sun comes up, right? And making the same inference. There's more information there. So thinking about cause explicitly, I think, is a really important thing for people to importantly engage with.
Again, explained really well. Where are we? Sorry. Siobhan asks, what do you think of medical data studying men, which is then used to treat women?
Yeah. It's a really important issue, and it's been a really important one for cardiovascular disease. It's been an important one for other ones. But part of the science, a point of science is to generalize. So we learn things in a scientific study, and if we do them in one population or group of people, and we try to generalize those findings to other groups of people, there's a very, substantial chance, certainly plausible chance, that those results will not transfer from one to the other. And so it's 100% a hugely important thing. And not just in terms of, and it's kind of twofold. There's the issue there of making the wrong inferences that reflect some kind of actual, mechanistic difference. But then we also have just the issue, of representation. So even if you have a situation where the results in the men were just as useful or valid for the results in the women, women are still then missing out on an opportunity to be involved in clinical research. So this is a thing in clinical trials in particular. Clinical trials tend to happen in places where people are more well off. There's a social patterning to clinical trial conduct, and that's a bad thing. It's not as bad in a place like Ireland, where you have a public health system. But if you talk about the States, you will almost never find clinical trials happening in community-based hospitals. They're always, associated with universities and private hospitals. And so those representation issues, again, even if it's not a scientific consideration, there's a deep ethical problem there when you're running medical studies that not everybody has the opportunity to participate in. Because again, it prevents people from having access to new and beneficial treatments. And we also know that people who are enrolled in clinical trials tend to do well. They get better care overall. So again, it's an important opportunity to miss. So there's kind of both of those, but it's a huge problem for both of those reasons.
Do you think it's changing at all? Do you think it's improving?
No. It is to some degree, right? There's more emphasis. So for example, I submitted a grant this morning actually to the HRB. And there's a section there on trying to consider gender issues in terms of the research we were doing. And importantly, you either explain what issues there could be, or you have even more words to explain why it's not an issue. And then they tell you very clearly, you better have done some research to feel very secure about that. So that's a very good movement, a very positive direction. And when the funders start to dictate some of this stuff is where you see some change happening for sure. So yeah, there is, it's maybe, but it's going awfully slow, I think.
Brilliant. I think we have the book in the chat now as well.
Oh, good. Thank you, whoever.
David Spiegelhalter. Anya asks then, should research skills be embedded in the curriculum a lot earlier than we do at present? Or does it need to be context of research projects, typically third or fourth year?
Yeah, so I'll speak to medicine in particular. We have this really bad habit of forcing people into research way too early in their careers. They need it for career progression. It's very hard to hold people accountable when they're asked to do research in a clinical environment. They're learning how to do their job as it is their regular job. They're being asked to do research. They're being asked not only to conduct that research, but to do it as if it was, the real deal, to publish it, to present it and everything else. And we're doing that before they really understand. Medicine is a really tricky area in that way, in that a lot of the science is done by people who are not trained as scientists. So it makes it especially difficult because they're being trained how to, treat people. I don't have to spend any time on my day doing surgery, or consulting with patients. I get to spend all my time doing research. So I suspect I'm a little better at it than someone else who has to spend their day doing something else, and vice versa. So I've written, like a fair bit of stuff about this issue and the need, one, for more training in statistics and data skills, and I'm sure lots of other stuff. I mean, I'm sure I could get started on the systematic reviews I see. You see, the systematic review has become all of a sudden an early career vehicle for projects. We'll have them do a systematic review. Well, that's really hard to do. And you just see people making a muck of it left, right, and center, both in terms of methods. So you see all these clownish search strategies and all the rest of it. But then the review is done by the people who are probably least qualified to really evaluate the literature going into that review, because they're so early on in their careers. It doesn't mean they're not smart or capable. They just don't have the experience and the support to do it correctly.
Yeah. The systematic review thing is frightening. I think there's a lot of us here in the room, as it's part of our profession, but that I think there's a lot of us that would see it as being specialist in itself. And I'd certainly have to do an awful lot of reading and studying, and probably change the area that I'm in now to be getting into systematic reviews and those search strategies. And then it's just frightening, the thought of those that that aren't trained in it at all,
yep.
picking it up, and suddenly it's part of their profession out of nowhere.
Well, then in medicine, we emphasize it even more. We label the systematic reviews as the better evidence. So just the fact that it's a systematic review. So not only is it not being done probably very well often, but we're also then giving it extra credence, which adds a whole other level of complication to things.
Yeah. And then
the joys.
All the other stuff you've pointed out, that can creep in there as well, and have an impact on those results. As I say, it's kind of frightening. So Brian says some academic peer-reviewed journals are now very explicit about accepting contrarian research findings. Do you think that's a good idea or counterproductive, or does it depend on the situation?
I mean, I guess it depends. I don't know. I think contrarian is a bit of a loaded word.
Yeah, what they call it contrarian, you see.
It kind of indicates that the point is to be a contrarian. I find myself sometimes holding contrary opinions to other people, but I don't think I'm a contrarian because it's not the purpose. Journals, like other places, are some degree interested in prestige and attention, and that comes in a lot of different ways. And I think traditionally it comes from people from highly prestigious institutions, and that kind of thing. And I don't know. I would need more context for that question. That's a Twitter question.
Yeah, Brian's actually clarified there. He's saying, by contrarian, I mean research, the findings of which are the opposite of the majority of findings in the field.
I mean, that's always a really important point, because it's one. I mean, most research doesn't exactly reproduce. I mean, there's always variability in results, and so there's always a statistical element of that. Where you're trying to explain why the one study maybe sits out of place, and it could just be the most obvious answer a lot of times it's just a very small study with a very noisy outcome measure, and you just got a kind of unlucky finding, so to speak. It just happened to not demonstrate the thing you thought it would. In other instances, there could be fundamental study design issues that have led to a bias that's baked into the results. And so that's what needed to be figured out. I mean, again, it's just kind of, one of those kind of pieces of detective work that you have to have the skills and the experience to do. And, it's not the kind of thing I would try to parachute into an area of research I don't understand very well, even as a statistician, and start to make, kind of clear, conclusions about why things look the way they do.
Probably related, actually, Aoife says reporting hype is becoming more and more common. Is this part of the incentives offered to researchers, or is this just bad journalism?
No, it's on us. I used to do the ranting and raving about the journalists. It feels really clear to me that it's on us if I'm speaking about the academia and the university sector. We see it constantly from researchers, from professors, from research leaders, and certainly not all of them. I'm not trying to cast that broad of a brush, but we see it frequently. It's my favorite example. I'll get into trouble here. Is artificial intelligence. There is a field of artificial intelligence, that's related to computational biology, computer science, and trying to understand how people think and how that can relate to how machines might one day think. And I don't know much about that, but I know that it's a serious. And if anybody does, they probably know that based on the gobbledygook of words that just came out of my mouth. But I know that it's a serious area of inquiry. In scientific endeavor. As a statistician, though, what I see all the time is people take all manner of predictive algorithms, things that we do in statistics all the time, sometimes using slightly different methods, but to do the exact same job. And they call them artificial intelligence. And so now we're going to take the artificial intelligence and we're going to match it up with big data, and we're going to personalize all the treatment effects. These are the things that really frustrate me the most, because all of that, 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, when you start see people talk about that kind of combination of things, you see it all the time, they can't do what they're saying they're going to do. And I feel very certain of that. So it's an issue. I think the hype stuff is a real issue, and it's from the researchers and it's from the universities when they're generating press releases. But again, when you cut the funding out of the university, and I don't know, maybe that's a great idea, maybe it's a terrible idea. I'm not going to I'm not trying to take a position on that. But when you cut the funding from universities and you make them reliant on attracting funding, then the way they're going to attract funding is to do exciting, amazing, incredible things. Every university on earth is a world-leading university, right? Everybody's above average. The place you work is incredible. And the reality is it's full of incredible people wherever you work. But, not everybody's the world leader in everything. It's very,
Yeah,
I'll stop talking now. I got to keep my job. So
no, I was going to add world leading to that as well. Yeah. Yeah, we all are. Yeah. I think if we were to look at any of our
you are the best.
But yeah, and I suppose, look, that probably brings us back to the whole open science movement and open data and, making everything fair and reproducible. Just having that QC, that quality control on this sort of stuff. So we can see whether it is actually world beating or it is absolutely new and never discovered before impact or result, or I suppose I'm going to ask you to confirm really my bias in that. Should we be making open publishing mandatory, but also should we be making registered reports mandatory? Should we be making visibility of raw data where possible, obviously outside of confidential information? Should we be making that available, visible, reusable, so that it can be checked and quality controlled?
Yep. I mean, I think that, I think where I stand on a lot of this. I mean, I think there's a lot of value in transparency in general. And we try to work in a very transparent way. We share our analysis code. We work closely with data now and trying to verify data and make it shareable, if not shared. Register reports is a fantastic idea. So for people who aren't familiar with that, when I talked about earlier on the topic, we register, outcomes from clinical trials, and that prevents people from switching them and kind of, glossing over some more, disappointing results in their studies and highlighting the more, the ones that they wanted to highlight. Register report is an idea where you essentially have peer review happen on your study before it takes place, and a commitment for the journal to publish the results regardless of the nature of the findings. So if you submit a register report of an important research question that you're going to answer with rigorous methods, then the journal agrees. If that passes peer review and everybody agrees that those two kind of conditions are checked, this is going to have feasible research, important question, rigorous, then the journal will commit to produce, to publish the paper when it's finished. I mean, unless you just make a total dog's dinner out of it or something. I think all of those things are very generally good ideas. And all of them kind of also speak to that Doug Altman quote about how we need less research, because less research means more time for quality research. But as we're all very familiar with, the incentives are completely backwards. And so the issue we have right now is we're asking a lot of young researchers to adopt new research practices that are aimed at improving the quality of research. But those earlier career people, if they're investing in that way, but they're not being rewarded for it, then they place themselves at a competitive disadvantage with their peers. And so if we're talking about academics who are trying desperately to stay in academic positions, then that's a tough pill to swallow, to expect humans to essentially, give up a career they've really been focused on for a very long period of time, because they're going to do things the right way and other people are going to take shortcuts essentially, and those people are going to be rewarded for it. So it's a very hard and frustrating problem.
Yep, completely agreed. We did a course there recently on research integrity, and that was essentially what we were teaching. Just that point that you made there at the end, and the early career researchers were, kind of unaware of it, but then when it had been highlighted, actually had recognized it throughout their, the research career that they had. And possibly making decisions there and then as to what should happen in the future. It's difficult to be a good researcher with the way the system is set up. So Akiboye asks there, are you aware of a significant number of medical trials done on Europeans but then applied to other ethnicities? Again, I think we're talking about the privilege or the area where the trial is set up and where it's applied afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's going to be, I think, a pretty common occurrence that trials happen where they can happen, where there's funding for them to happen. And I mean, typically this comes down to regulatory approval, right? So there are regulators in the United States and in Europe, and regulators require a substantial amount of evidence before approving a treatment, but they don't require an endless amount of evidence. And so if there is a small number of relatively high quality trials, and sometimes not so high quality trials, that get conducted, and they seem to consistently support the idea that a treatment is efficacious, then frequently that's going to go on, and that's going to become a treatment that's used widely in practice. One of the issues here, and we'll go down this road for a second if that's okay, is that it would make a lot of sense to then take those approved medications or treatments and continue to do studies on them where it's possible and where it makes ethical sense. And so you might have valid research questions about the generalizability of the result from those trials that underpin the approval, and the generalizability of those results to other groups. Now, I tend to think that in medicine, when we're talking about biology, that doesn't tend to be as much of a problem as it would be for other areas. And that for me, my interest is still mostly about the issues around lack of inclusion and the social disparities that result from that stuff, the lack of opportunity. That to me is the bigger problem. But we certainly could be doing more studies to investigate these kind of things. The problem is that we don't require industry to then conduct those studies. They're left for academic investigators to do. And that's also okay. But it's the academic investigators, because there's less money there to do that type of research, that are left with less support to do it. So the industry research is going to be well funded, well supported, lots of expert advice. Industry funded studies, are really well done typically. I think better than the average academic led study, because just the difference in resources. And so there's, again, those kind of things kind of continue on, because there's not a lot of incentive out there to continue those additional studies, unfortunately. But I'm not an expert in that area, to be clear. Like there's a lot written about it, though, you can certainly tuck into.
Great, thanks, Darren. Yeah, it's just kind of more kind of disappointing, really, kind of almost.
It's a long weekend. Don't lose sight. Don't lose sight. It's a long weekend.
That's true.
It's,
that's true.
Not raining. This is it's going to be a happy time.
But just based on that question there, just the finger of systemic racism kind of, reaches everywhere, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
I suppose that we all have responsibility to do what we can. So yeah, I suppose I just have one last question of my own, really, and it's just a general for dummies question, really. Can we trust the drugs and the medicine that are out there in general, Darren? Like, if we're worried about people that are sick and they're on new drugs. I suppose from my own reading of from your stuff and this area in general, it's frightening, that the level of reproducibility is so low. It's, it can be 50 to 70% of researchers aren't able to reproduce, high profile findings or studies in general. And does that mean really that the medicine that's out there, the stuff that's out there at the moment does that mean that it's 50 to 70% incorrect, or what? Or is that a terrible take?
No, I don't think there's a terrible take, but I have to say I am a lean positive on that. I have a fair bit of faith and confidence in the end product. When it comes to medical stuff, is highly regulated, and it doesn't mean there aren't problems, and it doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of. In fact, we have lots of treatments that turn out later on where evidence comes out and suggests that they were not at all efficacious. There's a lot of evidence of that. I think in terms of the overall system, there are things that could be improved, but I'm also not someone who, is too pessimistic, I guess. And I think it's a really hard and a really difficult topic that, again, I think it's more for chewing on and more deeper discussion rather than kind of just offering an opinion off the hip. But no, I have a lot of confidence in our kind of system overall for medical treatments.
Well, that's good. We'll take that. We'll.
There you go. Now, all the other stuff is maybe off the agenda, but there is some oversight there that doesn't exist in a lot of other areas of research, and it's another way where you see people offering presumed treatments for medical conditions, but they refuse to call it medicine, and they do that so they can avoid the regulator. And this is real common, supplements and dietary kind of stuff, and the stuff they sell at the pharmacy, that there's no evidence of doing anything. If it worked, they'd call it medicine, they'd have it, assessed properly, and they'd make all the money they could off of it, but it doesn't, so they don't and they can't.
Right, very good. So great. Well, that's positive in itself as well. If it was going to work, it would be there as a treatment. So we'll leave it on that positive note. So, and I'll leave Aoife sign you off there. Thanks a million, Darren.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks, Darren. That was really great. It was really interesting. I think I maybe need to update my own statistics education, but then I did learn to do ANOVAs using a calculator and a piece of paper. So, might be a little bit out of date.
Fair enough.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I always love hearing you talk. You always bring the concepts that are quite abstract and can be a little difficult if we don't need to deal with numbers on a daily basis down to ground level. So thank you so much for speaking with us. And there's lots of lovely comments in the chat there coming in. So, use those to kind of head into the weekend with a happy glow.
I very much will.
Great. Just to remind everybody of our speaker next week, his name is Thomas Patilla, and he is the Director of Information Systems and Technology Strategy at the Center for Research Libraries. He has over 10 years experience developing, consulting, publishing, presenting, and teaching on responsible computational use of cultural heritage collections, digital strategy, digital literacy, and digital scholarship and curation. He's going to look at how cultural heritage practitioners are simultaneously drawn to and horrified by the potential of AI, machine learning, and data science. And he will introduce the concept of responsible operations and articulate actions that libraries may take to make positive use of AI, machine learning, and data science in libraries. So not the horrible use of AI that we're seeing in spurious healthcare companies, but responsible use of AI. Thank you again, Darren, and also thanks to Trace, who did a stellar job on the questions, and Anya, who's been working away in the background, making sure everything is working smoothly, and to the rest of the LIR committee for helping set this whole thing up, and our lovely audience for their questions. Have a lovely weekend, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Aoife. Cheers. Bye.